Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. They did not yell at me. They did not hurl crude insults. They did something far colder. They slid a thick envelope across the mahogany table, placing a price tag on my marriage, and waited for me to sign it away like a corporate expense being stricken from their ledgers. The only detail they failed to realize was that the quiet woman they were attempting to buy out was the daughter of their family empire's largest shareholder. My name is Meyer Hughes. I am 34 years old, and I live a life dictated by cold logistics and undeniable urgency. As a crisis dispatch supervisor at the Interstate Recovery Logistics Authority in Atlanta, my days are measured in dispatch response times, rerouted supply chains, and large-scale disasters that require immediate containment. I deal in hard facts, broken infrastructure, and concrete solutions. I absolutely do not deal in pretense. My world is grounded in reality, which is why when I arrived at the Mercer family estate in Charlotte that evening, I wore a simple, unbranded black dress. I had no intention of competing in a game of superficial aesthetics. I was not there to impress anyone. I was only there because I was married to their son. The drive from Atlanta to Charlotte had been a suffocating ordeal lasting over 2.5 hours. Grant Mercer, my husband, the heavily titled Vice President of Strategy and in-house counsel for his family empire, Mercer Infrastructure Dynamics, was entirely unreadable. He drove his sleek sedan with a rigid posture, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. He barely spoke a single word to me every few minutes. His eyes darted nervously to his phone resting in the center console. He was bracing for an impact, radiating a frantic energy. I mistakenly assumed the tension was simply the usual friction between an ambitious son and his demanding parents. I had absolutely no idea I was the casualty he was preparing to sacrifice. The Mercer mansion was a terrifying monument to old money and corporate ruthlessness. It was a sprawling historic estate that felt less like a family home and much more like a curated museum where nothing was allowed to be touched. Heavy silver cutlery gleamed under the soft ambient lighting. Flawless crystal glasses caught the distorted reflections of the massive chandelier suspended above the dining table. A faint sterile jazz melody drifted through the cavernous room, just loud enough to prevent absolute silence, but quiet enough to ensure every whispered threat could be heard with perfect clarity. But the coldest things in that house by far were the eyes of my in-laws. Victor and Elise Mercer did not look at me the way normal people look at family. They scanned me. Their gazes swept systematically over my unadorned neck, my simple watch, my practical shoes, assessing my total net worth faster than a barcode scanner at a retail checkout. The dinner service commenced with a painfully polite, rigid facade. Then, the real agenda of the evening began. Victor Mercer, a man whose entire existence revolved around aggressive leverage and market dominance, did not bother asking me about my well-being. He bypassed all traditional social graces and launched an interrogation, thinly veiled as dinner-table conversation. He asked pointedly about my exact annual salary. He inquired about the specific number of hours I worked each week. He wanted to know the absolute ceiling of my upward mobility at the Logistics Authority. His tone was casual yet terrifyingly surgical. He was actively building a corporate valuation profile of my life right there over the roasted duck. He was trying to mathematically determine exactly how little I was worth. Elise Mercer seamlessly picked up the offensive exactly where her husband paused. She took a measured sip of her wine and offered a chilling smile that never reached her eyes. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with refined elegance, and informed me that women who marry into legacy families rarely understand the immense gravity of their new situation. She stated clearly that a name like Mercer possessed a tangible, highly lucrative market value, and that preserving that brand required strict obedience from those brought into the fold. It was a florless, passive, aggressive strike. With one perfectly constructed sentence, she made it unequivocally clear that they had never viewed me as family. I was a liability to them. I was an unpredictable risk factor they had been actively monitoring since the day Grant put a ring on my finger. Halfway through the main course, the thin charade abruptly ended. Victor wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, reached deliberately into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket, and withdrew a thick, securely sealed envelope. The massive dining room seemed to immediately lose all of its oxygen as he placed the heavy paper on the polished mahogany. He slid it smoothly across the wood until it came to a halt directly next to my dinner plate. He simply tapped the thick paper once with his index finger, waiting for my compliance. Inside that envelope was a meticulously drafted, utterly ruthless exit strategy. There was a cashier check made out to me for a sum extending deep into the seven figures. Beneath that check lay a comprehensive separation agreement, a draconian non-disclosure agreement designed to silence me forever, and a detailed road map for my immediate departure from Grant's wife. They had literally priced my marriage. They had coldly calculated a buy-up figure, operating on the arrogant assumption that a working-class woman with my modest background would see a string of zeros and immediately forfeit her dignity. But the staggering amount of money was not what sent a jolt of pure ice through my veins. The true shock came when I turned my head to look at the man sitting right beside me. Grant did not flinch when the envelope crossed the table. He did not leap out of his chair in righteous outrage. My husband, the man who had promised to protect and stand by me, merely stared down at his half-empty wine glass like a coward. He utterly refused to meet my eyes. When he finally opened his mouth to speak, his voice was a pathetic, hollow whisper. He told me that they were just trying to do this the easy way. He knew. He had known the entire suffocating car ride from Atlanta. He had known while we walked hand in hand through the heavy front doors of the estate. He had known while I sat there being verbally dissected and humiliated by his parents. He was fully in on the slaughter. I turned my attention away from my cowardly husband and looked down at the documents spilling out of the envelope. I am a woman who manages complex logistics, analyzes dense contracts, and untangles corporate crisis for a living. I know how to spot anomalies. As my eyes scanned the crisp white paper, I noticed a terrifying, incredibly arrogant detail that they had overlooked. The specific font choice, the precise margin alignments, and the distinct boilerplate formatting on the final signature page were unmistakable. This was not a private document drafted quietly by a discreet family divorce lawyer. This material had been carelessly generated using the official templates of the corporate legal department at Mercer Infrastructure Dynamics. They were illegally utilizing the legal resources of a publicly operating corporation to execute a personal domestic purge. A lesser woman might have screamed at the sheer indignity of it all. Another woman might have thrown her heavy crystal glass against the expensive wallpaper, burst into hysterical tears, and fled into the dark Carolina night. I did absolutely none of those things. The betrayal was so absolute, so structurally profound and unforgivable, that it entirely bypassed my capacity for grief and went straight to a cold crystalline clarity. They genuinely thought they had backed a desperate, ordinary woman into a corner she could not escape from. They did not know they had just handed a loaded, legally compromising weapon to the only daughter of the absolute largest shareholder of their precious company. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not show them a single ounce of the pain tearing through my chest. I calmly reached out, gathered the offensive documents, and neatly slipped them back into the thick envelope. With the flat palm of my hand, I pushed it slowly back across the table, watching it slide until it stopped directly in front of Victor Mercer. I held his arrogant, expectant gaze for a long moment, letting the heavy silence stretch until the tension in the room became almost unbearable for everyone but me. I leaned back in my dining chair, perfectly composed, and delivered my final assessment of their offer. I told him he should keep that money. I told him he would probably need it long before I ever did. 3 years ago, the southeastern seaboard was entirely submerged under the wrath of a Category 4 hurricane. The storm had ripped through coastal towns, severing power lines and washing away primary supply routes. For 3 consecutive days, I had barely slept. I was barricaded inside the logistics command center, staring at glowing maps, calculating fuel reserves, and redirecting fleets of heavy supply trucks carrying fresh water and medical provisions to cities that were desperately trying to survive. By the time I finally stepped out of the office on a dreary Tuesday evening, my brain was a chaotic web of highway numbers, tonnage calculations, and disaster relief protocols. I walked into a small, dimly lit coffee shop situated just 2 blocks from the main train station. I was exhausted, wearing a wrinkled cotton shirt and a faded canvas jacket, seeking nothing more than a quiet corner and a massive cup of black coffee. That was when Grant walked into my life. He stood near the counter, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place amidst the tired commuters and damp coats. The fabric was immaculate, the cut incredibly precise, clearly tailored by someone who charged thousands of dollars for their time. But when he turned and offered to pay for my coffee after I clumsily dropped my wallet on the floor, he did not speak with the arrogant drawl of a wealthy man accustomed to throwing cash at inconveniences. His voice was soft, measured, and deeply polite. We ended up sitting at a small wooden table near the rain-streaked window. I fully expected him to talk about himself, to boast about whatever high-powered corporate position required such an expensive wardrobe. Instead, he asked about my day, and then, surprisingly, he actually listened. He listened as I talked about routing algorithms and the nightmare of coordinating supply drops in flooded zones. He watched me with a quiet, intense fascination. There was a grounded intelligence in his eyes that made me drop my guard. He did not seem like the stereotypical rich heir looking for a distraction. He seemed like a man desperate for a connection built on something real. At that time, my life was deliberately stripped down to the bare essentials. I lived in a modest 600-T rented apartment in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood. I drove a 10-year-old sedan that rattled whenever I pushed it past 60 mph on the interstate. My personal space was completely devoid of clutter, expensive art, or designer furniture. When your entire professional existence revolves around managing chaos, predicting shortages, and analyzing the precise quantities of goods needed to keep devastated cities alive, you develop a profound aversion to excess. I wanted my home to be a silent sanctuary, an empty canvas where I could decompress from the heavy burden of consequence. I did not need luxury. I needed peace. Grant found my lifestyle completely mesmerizing. In his world, every woman he met measured a man by the zip code of his primary residence, the brand of the watch on his wrist, and the exclusivity of his vacation destinations. I did none of those things. When he picked me up for our dates, I never glanced twice at the leather interior of his luxury car. I never asked him how much his dinner reservations cost. I never inquired about his investment portfolio. I treated him exactly the same whether we were eating cheap street food under a city awning or sitting in a high-end restaurant with cloth napkins and soft lighting. It took him nearly 4 months to finally reveal the true scope of his background. We were sitting on the worn fabric sofa in my tiny living room when he took a deep breath, his hands nervously gripping a mug of tea. He confessed that he was not just a successful corporate lawyer. He told me he was the son of the founding family of Mercer Infrastructure Dynamics. He explained how his family had built a colossal empire manufacturing steel bridges, developing emergency transport modules, and controlling urban water systems across the nation. He watched my face closely, waiting for my eyes to widen, waiting for my attitude to shift, waiting for the sudden realization that I had just hit a matrimonial jackpot. My expression remained completely unchanged. I simply nodded, took a sip of my own tea, and asked him if the pressure of carrying that legacy was exhausting. I could physically see the relief wash over his entire body. The tension drained from his shoulders, and he let out a breath he had clearly been holding for weeks. He was absolutely thrilled. He began telling his inner circle of friends that he had finally found a woman who was completely untainted by ambition, a woman who loved him strictly for the man he was, completely separate from the heavy weight of the Mercer fortune. He was entirely convinced he had found a rare, simple treasure. But as our relationship deepened into its second year, I began to notice a subtle, darker undercurrent beneath his gentlemanly exterior. Grant loved my simplicity, yes, but he loved it for the wrong reasons. He deeply enjoyed the power dynamic it created between us. He liked being the one who could afford to fix my broken car. He liked the feeling of stepping into my small apartment and knowing he represented a massive upgrade in my standard of living. He thrived on the unspoken assumption that he was the provider, the savior, the one bringing a vast, secure future into the relationship. He needed to feel like he was the grand prize I had somehow been lucky enough to win. I saw it in the way he subtly steered conversations, the way he would dismiss my minor financial concerns with a wave of his hand, and the way he smiled a little too proudly when he introduced me to his wealthy colleagues as his humble, hard-working girlfriend. He was not just relieved by my lack of wealth, he was empowered by it. I never corrected his fundamental misunderstanding. I never sat him down and explained the reality of my own financial standing. This was not some cruel, calculated game to test his loyalty. It was simply a matter of honoring the primary lesson my father had drilled into my head since I was a young girl. My father always told me never to introduce myself with my assets. He told me to let the world believe whatever they wanted to believe about my bank account. He said that if you strip away the money and present yourself as ordinary, people will quickly reveal their true character. They will show you exactly how they treat someone they believe holds no leverage over them. So I remained quiet. I let Grant feel tall. I let him feel powerful. I let him believe he was the sole financial pillar of our future. We were married on a crisp afternoon in late October. It was a small, elegant ceremony held in a beautiful botanical garden. There were no media cameras, no excessive displays of corporate wealth, just a handful of close friends and the crushing judgmental presence of his parents. His mother, Elise, spent the entire afternoon radiating a silent, toxic disapproval. She looked at my modest silk dress and my lack of aristocratic heritage as if I were a deliberate insult to her lineage, but I ignored her icy stares. I was focused entirely on the man holding my hands. As we stood at the altar and exchanged our vows, Grant looked down at me with a smile of absolute confidence. He genuinely believed he was marrying a capable, grounded, but ultimately ordinary woman who would seamlessly bend to the gravity of his family name. He squeezed my fingers gently, looking at me with a profound sense of ownership disguised as protective love. He was sealing a deal. He was securing a wife who would never ask for too much, who would never challenge his financial supremacy, and who would remain eternally grateful for the life he was generously providing. He thought he held all the winning cards. He thought his wealth was the invisible fence that would always keep me safely contained within his world. That arrogant assumption, born from a lifetime of privilege and a desperate need to feel superior, would eventually become the single greatest blind spot of his entire existence. It was the fatal flaw that would ultimately tear his carefully constructed life apart. The weeks following our quiet wedding were characterized by a profound and ringing silence from my new in-laws. They were always supposedly occupied with incredibly pressing matters. Elise had endless charity galas to organize and society luncheons to attend. Victor was perpetually managing aggressive quarterly expansions and international supply chain acquisitions. Grant excused their constant absence with practiced ease, citing back-to-back board meetings and brutal corporate travel schedules. But in my specific line of work, you learn to read the dangerous white space between the lines of a delay. When a massive supply truck stalls for 3 days outside a critical depot, it is never just bad traffic. It is a deliberate customs hold. The Mercers were not truly busy. They were stalling. They were placing me in a forced holding pattern while they quietly conducted a comprehensive background check to see if I was actually worthy of formal integration into their elite stratosphere. Then came the gifts. They arrived by private courier, delivered to my small apartment in heavy embossed boxes tied with thick velvet ribbons. Elise never once called to ask how I was doing or if I was adjusting well to married life. Instead, she sent a handmade Italian leather handbag that cost more than I made in 3 entire months. A few weeks later, she sent a fragile crystal vase, so absurdly expensive that I had to hide it in the back of my hall closet to avoid shattering it. These were absolutely not gestures of warm maternal affection. They were heavy, silent instructions. Each delivery was a passive-aggressive reminder that my current practical standard of living was entirely unacceptable to her. She was trying to bury my ordinary existence under thick layers of high society armor, subtly demanding that I elevate my tastes to meet their demanding baseline of acceptability. While Elise tried to mold my physical appearance with luxury goods, Grant's younger sister took a much more clinical and terrifying approach. Celeste Mercer was the powerful director of public image for the family foundation. She treated her surname like a fragile geopolitical alliance that needed constant military defense. She never invited me to a casual lunch or asked a single question about my childhood. Instead, she launched a quiet forensic audit of my entire online presence. I maintained a very sparse digital footprint, mostly consisting of old photos with my college friends, volunteers from the local disaster relief shelters, and the exhausted dispatchers I worked with during grueling late-night shifts. To Celeste, this reality was an absolute public relations disaster. I later learned through a careless mutual acquaintance that Celeste had officially categorized my social circle as a low-value ecosystem. She deeply believed my friends were far too pedestrian, too aggressively middle class, and ultimately entirely misaligned with the pristine, untouchable luxury brand the Mercer family had spent decades fiercely cultivating. The true friction, however, came from Grant himself. He started slipping. He began dropping small, unconscious remarks that perfectly mirrored the toxic, calculating environment he was raised in. Whenever I politely declined to wear the ostentatious diamond necklace Elise sent for a casual dinner date, Grant would sigh heavily and adjust his expensive cuffs. He would tell me in a soft, patronizing tone that his family just wanted to make sure I was not overwhelmed by their world. He said it over and over again, treating me exactly like a simpleton, wandering aimlessly through a dangerous financial intersection. It was in those quiet moments in our kitchen that a cold realization finally settled permanently over my mind. This family did not actually hate me. Hate requires passion. Hate requires viewing someone as an equal adversary. The Mercers absolutely did not view me as an equal. They were simply ranking me, and they had permanently placed me at the absolute bottom of their corporate spreadsheet. This unspoken hierarchy was put on full public display 6 months into our marriage during a massive corporate gala hosted by Mercer Infrastructure Dynamics. It was my very first official appearance as a recognized member of the family. The ballroom was a suffocating sea of tailored tuxedos, strategic handshakes, and predatory networking. Victor held court near the center of the massive room, surrounded by regional politicians and major supply chain contractors. When Grant guided me over to join the powerful circle, Victor did not offer a warm smile. He gestured toward me with a casual, dismissive flick of his wrist. He introduced me to the group of wealthy men as Grant's new wife, quickly adding with a condescending chuckle that I worked at some dispatch agency downtown. He purposefully stripped away my entire professional identity. He deliberately erased the complex crisis management I handled daily and reduced my high-stakes career to a trivial clerical job. He wanted the entire room to know that I was a nobody, a simple civilian who had merely married well. The men chuckled politely, offering me patronizing nods. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not shrink away into the shadows. I merely smiled back at them, offering a calm and vacant expression that gave them absolutely no satisfaction. 10 minutes later, while we were still standing at the edge of that exact same circle, my phone began to vibrate violently inside my clutch. It was the emergency bypass line from the Logistics Authority. A major bridge collapse in a neighboring state had just severed a primary transit artery for critical medical freight. Several large regional hospitals were going to run out of surgical supplies within 48 hours. Victor paused his boastful conversation, visibly annoyed by the buzzing. I did not excuse myself to the restroom. I did not hide in the quiet hallway. I answered the emergency call right there at the dinner table. The senior logistics director was panicking loudly on the other end of the line. I immediately shut down his panic. I slipped seamlessly into my command voice, a tone sharp enough to cut through solid glass. I ordered him to reroute the entire northern fleet through the secondary highway system. I dictated the exact load distribution ratios completely from memory. I authorized a severe budget override for emergency fuel provisions and commanded him to secure an immediate state police escort for the first 5 trucks carrying crucial blood supplies. The entire intense exchange lasted less than 2 minutes. When I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my bag, the silence in our immediate circle was absolute. The wealthy contractors who had been openly dismissing me moments earlier were now staring at me with wide, shocked eyes. I had just commanded a logistical maneuver involving millions of dollars in freight and potentially hundreds of human lives without breaking a single sweat, all while casually holding a glass of sparkling water. I looked directly at Victor. I genuinely expected to see a tiny flicker of respect, perhaps a begrudging acknowledgement that I was a highly capable professional. Instead, his jaw was tight. His eyes were cold, dark, and frantically calculating. Elise, standing right beside him, looked visibly distressed by my display of competence. They were not impressed by my skills. They were deeply alarmed. They had carefully planned on dealing with a grateful, easily manipulated girl who would be far too intimidated by their wealth to ever speak up or take control. What they saw in that specific moment was a woman who possessed a terrifying amount of internal autonomy. I clearly knew how to make heavy, consequential decisions. I did not look to men in expensive suits for permission to act. To a family that aggressively controlled everything and everyone in their massive orbit, my independence was not seen as an asset. It was viewed as a severe, unmanageable threat. We left the Garler shortly after that incident. The long ride home was thick with an unsettling, suffocating tension. Grant stared blindly out the passenger window, flatly refusing to comment on what had just happened. When we finally pulled into our dark driveway, I turned the engine off and asked him straight out why his parents looked at me like I was a hostile corporate takeover rather than a new daughter-in-law. Grant unbuckled his seat belt slowly. He did not turn his head to look at me. He stared straight ahead into the empty garage and delivered a perfectly calm line that sent a physical chill straight down my spine. He told me that I just needed to understand his parents. He said they just like to know exactly who they are dealing with. I sat completely frozen in the driver's seat as he walked away and entered the house. It was a perfectly polite sentence, but the underlying implication was devastatingly clear. I finally understood the total truth. This entire marriage had never been about love, family integration, or building a life with a partner. I was permanently trapped in the middle of a ruthless, ongoing corporate risk assessment. They were systematically auditing my personality, testing my boundaries, and measuring my leverage. It was not a difficult family dynamic. It was an appraisal. And the truly terrifying part was that I knew they were currently getting ready to issue their final unforgiving verdict. The machinery of a billionaire family does not operate in the light. When they decide you are a problem, they do not confront you. They investigate you. Following the incident at the corporate Garler, my sister-in-law escalated her quiet disapproval into an active, fully funded espionage operation. I was completely unaware at the time, but Celeste had contracted a premier private intelligence firm to excavate my entire past. They were looking for dirt. They were desperate to find a hidden scandal, a secret bankruptcy, a string of embarrassing ex-lovers, or a trail of unpaid parking tickets. They wanted leverage. Instead, they hit a solid wall of excruciatingly boring reality. The investigators combed through my background and found absolutely nothing but a terrifyingly clean slate. They verified my tiny apartment lease. They noted the make and model of my outdated sedan. They pulled my employment records and saw the grueling hours I logged at the logistics authority. My financial history was a straight, unbending line of modest income and frugal expenditures. To a family that survived on blackmail and hidden leverage, a clean background is not reassuring. It is highly suspicious. Then, the private investigators finally found a single thread they thought they could pull to unravel me. They discovered a recurring financial anomaly. Every single month on the second day of the month, a significant portion of my salary was wired into an external untraceable account. The intelligence firm flagged this immediately. The Mercer family eagerly seized upon this data point, twisting it to fit their predetermined narrative. They rushed to the cynical conclusion that I was secretly funneling their son's wealth to a parasitic family member or perhaps servicing a massive hidden gambling debt. It fit their worldview perfectly. Poor people, in their eyes, were always desperate and deceitful. The truth was entirely different and completely hidden from their aggressive scrutiny. That monthly transfer was my quiet contribution to a specialized housing trust. I funded a private initiative that secured accessible housing for former disaster rescue personnel who had sustained severe career-ending injuries in the field. I never spoke about it. I never claimed a tax deduction for it. It was a private duty born from my deep respect for the people who actually did the heavy lifting during crisis. But the Mercers did not understand silent philanthropy. If a charitable donation did not include a tax write-off and a bronze plaque bearing their name, they could not comprehend its existence. My mother-in-law, Elise, took this flawed intelligence report and weaponized it. She entirely misinterpreted my quiet demeanor where Grant saw refreshing simplicity. Elise saw a lethal, calculated ambition. She convinced herself, and eventually her husband, that I was a masterful actress. In her mind, I was executing a brilliant long con. She believed I was intentionally playing the role of the humble, undemanding girl, specifically to secure my grip on Grant and climb the social ladder. She thought I was simply waiting for the ink to dry on the marriage certificate before revealing my true greedy nature. A woman who does not demand expensive things must be scheming to take everything. That was the only logic Elise understood. While Elise operated on social paranoia, Victor operated purely on corporate strategy. Mercer Infrastructure Dynamics was rapidly approaching a critical juncture. A massive succession vote was scheduled for the upcoming third quarter. Victor was aggressively maneuvering to elevate Grant to a much higher, highly visible executive position within the global conglomerate. To secure the confidence of the board of directors, Grant needed to project absolute stability. He needed to present a flawless, highly marketable family unit. Victor concluded that a fiercely independent wife who made executive decisions at dinner parties and secretly wired money to unknown accounts was a massive, unacceptable variable. I was an unpredictable element, and in Victor's empire unpredictable elements were swiftly eradicated. This was where the family hostility mutated into something genuinely dangerous. The campaign to remove me stopped being a petty domestic dispute and crossed a massive illegal boundary into corporate warfare. Victor did not just hire a family divorce attorney. He quietly instructed the general counsel of his publicly traded company to begin drafting my exit strategy. They were actively utilizing corporate legal resources, billing company hours, and using official infrastructure to manage a personal domestic issue. It was a staggering abuse of power, a fatal, arrogant misstep born from decades of believing they were entirely above the law. The most tragic revelation was the extent of my husband's complicity. Grant knew. He knew his parents were officially evaluating our marriage. He knew they were unhappy and pushing for a resolution. But Grant was a man who survived by living in a state of perpetual denial. He desperately lied to himself, believing his father only wanted a harsh but necessary family discussion to set some boundaries. He completely underestimated the sheer ruthlessness of his own bloodline. He never imagined they would go as far as drafting a legally binding separation agreement to slide across a dinner table. I uncovered the depth of this conspiracy purely by accident. Just hours before that fateful dinner in Charlotte, I was walking down the hallway of our home toward Grant's home office to tell him I was ready to leave for the drive. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I stopped when I heard the sheer panic in his voice. He was on the phone with his father. I stood frozen in the quiet hallway, listening to the man I married stammer and backpedal. Grant sounded like a terrified junior employee begging for a deadline extension. Then the volume on his speakerphone must have been turned up because I heard Victor's voice cut through the air with the cold mechanical precision of a butcher's blade. Victor did not sound angry. He sounded like he was reading a quarterly earnings report. He told Grant that they could not afford any distractions. He explicitly stated that they must clear out all personal liabilities before the next quarter begins. Personal liabilities. He was talking about me. He was not talking about a difficult daughter-in-law. He was talking about a line item on a spreadsheet that needed to be deleted to balance the books. In that chilling moment outside the office door, the final pieces of the puzzle slammed into place. I finally understood the rules of the game I was trapped in. I was not the target of their hatred because I lacked manners or pedigree. I was the target because my very existence was suddenly deemed a strategic risk to their corporate ascension. They were preparing for a corporate cleansing, and I was the dirt they intended to sweep away. When Grant finally emerged from his office, his face pale and his posture rigid, I did not ask him about the phone call. I did not confront him in the hallway. I simply picked up my coat, walked out to the car, and got into the passenger seat. As we began the long drive to Charlotte, I stared out the window into the fading light. I knew I was actively walking into an ambush. I knew a storm was coming. I was entirely prepared for a brutal confrontation. But even with all my analytical skills, even with the explicit warning I had just overheard, I still could not have possibly imagined the sheer calculated coldness of the envelope they were waiting to slide across that mahogany table. The thick envelope sat exactly where I had pushed it, resting like a live explosive in the center of the polished mahogany table. The massive dining room seemed to instantly swallow every trace of ambient sound, leaving only the heavy, suffocating weight of my sudden defiance. I kept my posture perfectly straight. I did not let my shoulders drop a single fraction of an inch. I kept my eyes locked directly on my father-in-law. I did not blink, and I certainly did not look away. I'd asked him a very simple, incredibly direct question. I asked him exactly who had drafted those specific pages. Victor Mercer shifted his considerable weight in his heavy antique dining chair. For a man who had spent 3 decades accustomed to barking orders across boardrooms and receiving immediate, unquestioning compliance, my calm, icy interrogation was clearly jarring. He cleared his throat, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, attempting to wave away my inquiry as if it were a minor, irrelevant administrative detail. He flatly refused to give me a name. He tried to pivot the conversation back to the financial benefits of the severance package before the tense silence could stretch any further. Elise Mercer leaned forward into the warm light of the crystal chandelier. Her voice was perfectly modulated, carrying the chilling, rhythmic cadence of a seasoned public relations executive actively managing a corporate crisis. She offered a tight, artificial smile and stated that everything on that table, including the vast sum of money, was simply designed to minimize any future fallout for everyone involved. I did not respond to her. I turned my head slowly to the right, shifting my focus entirely to the man sitting beside me. This was the defining moment. This was the absolute last fraction of a second where Grant could have salvaged our marriage, his dignity, and his own soul. He could have pushed his chair back, stood up, grabbed my hand, and walked us both out of that toxic, suffocating mausoleum. Instead, he reached out and lightly touched my forearm under the table. His fingers were cold, weak, and trembling slightly. He leaned in toward me and whispered, his voice trembling with a pathetic desperation, pleading with me not to make a big deal out of it. That single cowardly sentence severed the very last remaining thread of my affection for him. It was an instant surgical emotional amputation. In that exact moment, looking at his pale, terrified face, I fully understood the pathetic reality of his character. He was not a helpless victim of his overbearing, controlling parents. He was an active, willing participant in his own subjugation. He feared their stern disapproval, their potential withdrawal of his vast inheritance, and their corporate wrath, far more than he feared losing the woman he had sworn to protect and honor. I ignored his touch, pulling my arm away from his grasp. I reached back across the expansive table, sliding the thick stack of papers out of the heavy envelope one more time. I completely ignored the cashier check with its long, insulting string of zeros. I flipped directly past the standard separation terms and focused on the dense legal clauses buried deep in the back of the agreement. My eyes, highly trained to rapidly scan massive logistical contracts for fatal loopholes and liability traps, caught a specific paragraph near the bottom of the 3rd page. I read the dense legal text carefully, my mind instantly processing the monumental error they had just made. The strict non-disclosure agreement explicitly forbade me from ever discussing any sensitive information related to governance structure and succession planning. My breath hitched in my throat, not from sorrow, but from a sudden, sharp thrill of absolute clarity. That specific phrasing was a monumental, legally catastrophic blunder. You do not insert corporate governance clauses and executive succession terminology into a private personal domestic relations contract unless the two entities are inextricably linked. The truth hit me with the force of a freight train. They were not just trying to quietly push an unwanted pedestrian daughter-in-law out of their annual family holiday photos. They were aggressively attempting to legally erase me from the entire picture right before a massive, fundamental shift in the company hierarchy. Victor, entirely mistaking my intense, silent focus for quiet submission, decided to press his perceived advantage. He steepled his fingers beneath his chin, adopting the arrogant, patronizing tone of a senior mentor explaining a complex business strategy to a slow, inexperienced intern. He subtly revealed the overarching architectural plan of their cruelty. He explained in a voice devoid of any human empathy that Grant would soon be transitioning into a highly public, heavily scrutinized executive role that required absolute market confidence. He looked at me with flat, dead eyes and stated clearly that a suitable, highly polished partner was a critical market factor. I was not a human being to them. I was never a wife. I was a volatile, unpredictable stock they were desperately trying to short before the opening bell. I slowly placed the dense legal papers flat on the table. I smoothed out a tiny, almost invisible crease in the corner of the top page. I looked around the lavish, silent room, taking in the absurd wealth, the gleaming crystal glasses, and the three hollow, roofless people sitting across from me. I gathered my breath and asked a question that brought the entire room to a freezing, absolute halt. I asked them if I were truly as poor and desperate as they automatically assumed I was. Did they honestly believe they had the fundamental right to buy my total silence simply because it was cheaper than showing me basic human respect? The silence that immediately followed was absolute. It was thick, heavy, and completely suffocating. No one moved a single muscle. Even the faint, sterile jazz music playing through the hidden speakers seemed to pause in anticipation. Elise was the only person at the table who maintained her cold composure. Her polite, aristocratic mask remained perfectly intact, but the raw, ugly truth of her nature finally bled right through her refined, elegant voice. She looked at me as if I were a muddy footprint on her expensive imported rug and stated with chilling calm that they were simply trying to avoid a messy conclusion. There it was, the unvarnished, brutal truth. I was nothing more than a mess that required an expensive cleaning service. I placed both of my hands flat on the edge of the mahogany table and pushed myself up from the heavy chair. I moved with absolute terrifying precision. I did not throw my linen napkin in a fit of rage. I did not slam my palms against the wood. I stood tall, smoothing the front of my simple black dress, projecting an aura of total unbreakable control. I calmly gathered my small clutch from the seat beside me. I turned my body to walk away, but I stopped and looked down at Grant one final defining time. He was staring blankly down at his half-eaten plate, thoroughly and completely defeated. I kept my voice low, ensuring every single syllable cut straight through the air and down to his bones. I told him that the money was not the thing that hurt me. I told him that what truly broke me was the absolute fact that he sat there in silence and allowed them to write a price tag for my life. I turned my back on the Mercer family and walked deliberately out of the dining room. My heels clicked sharply and rhythmically against the pristine marble floors of the grand foyer. I pushed open the heavy ornate front doors and stepped out into the crisp, dark Carolina night. The cold air hit my face, and for the first time in 3 long years, I felt entirely free. I was halfway down the sweeping manicured gravel driveway, my hand reaching out for the door handle of my outdated sedan when I heard the heavy front doors bang open behind me. Grant was jogging down the stone steps, his dress shoes crunching loudly against the gravel. For a brief, irrational second, I thought he might actually apologize. I thought he might have finally found a tiny shred of courage buried deep within his corporate soul. But as he reached the car, his face was twisted in an ugly, defensive scowl. He did not beg for my forgiveness. He did not ask me to stay. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at my chest and angrily blamed me for humiliating his parents in their own home. He accused me of being impossibly stubborn and failing to see the logical, beneficial business side of the arrangement they had generously offered. He was completely, irreversibly lost to them. I did not argue with him. I did not waste a single breath defending myself to a man who had already surrendered his spine to a balance sheet. I simply opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the ignition. The old engine roared to life, a loud, unrefined, and beautiful sound that echoed harshly across the pristine, silent estate. I put the car in gear and drove away. I did not look back in the rearview mirror to watch him fade into the darkness. I drove out through the massive iron gates and merged immediately onto the dark, empty highway. I did not book a room at a local hotel in Charlotte to cry. I did not point my car back south toward my quiet, empty apartment in Atlanta. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling the steady vibration of the engine, and pointed my car straight west. I drove directly into the dark Appalachian foothills, heading deep into rural Tennessee. I was going to see the one man on earth who possessed the absolute terrifying power to transform this arrogant, private insult into a catastrophic, foundation-shattering earthquake. The drive deep into the Appalachian Mountains took just over 4 hours. I pulled my car onto a gravel driveway in a quiet, densely wooded suburb in eastern Tennessee just before sunrise. The house sitting at the end of the road was not a sprawling mansion guarded by iron gates. It was a sturdy, beautifully maintained single-story cedar home wrapped in a wide porch. This was the sanctuary of Calvin Hughes, my father. To the few neighbors who knew him, my father was simply a retired contractor who liked to spend his mornings woodworking and his afternoons fishing in the nearby lake. He wore faded canvas work jackets and heavy boots. He drove a domestic pickup truck that possessed a few noticeable dents along the bumper. They did not know that the quiet man who happily helped them fix their lawnmowers was an industrial titan who had spent 4 decades building, scaling, and quietly selling massive infrastructure repair firms, bridge construction companies, and commercial freight logistics networks across the country. When I walked through his front door, he was already awake, sitting at the worn-up kitchen table with a steaming mug of black coffee. He took one long look at my exhausted face, the still perfect black dress, and the rigid tension radiating from my shoulders. He did not rush to coddle me. He stood up, poured a second mug of coffee, set it gently on the table, and pulled out a chair. He simply told me to sit down and tell him everything. I laid out the entire sequence of events from the dining room in Charlotte. I walked him through the calculated interrogation, the sudden appearance of the heavy envelope, the exact phrasing of Elise and her cold demands, and Grant sitting frozen like a terrified child. Most fathers would have immediately erupted into a blind, wise, protective rage upon hearing how their only daughter had been humiliated and priced out like a defective appliance. Calvin Hughes did not raise his voice. His expression did not harden into anger. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and listened with the terrifying absolute stillness of an apex predator observing a very slow, very careless prey. When I finished, he did not offer empty platitudes. He asked for incredibly precise, surgical questions. He asked me exactly who physically pushed the envelope across the table. He asked who claimed authorship of the text. He asked precisely how much Grant admitted to knowing beforehand. And finally, he asked if there was any physical indication that official corporate counsel had been utilized to draft the terms. Up until that last question, my father had been treating the situation as a deeply unfortunate, pathetic display of bad manners. But when I confirmed the distinct formatting, the specific corporate legal clauses, and the unmistakable boilerplate templates belonging to the internal legal department of Mercer Infrastructure Dynamics, the atmosphere in the kitchen shifted violently. My father placed his coffee mug down. The soft, comforting demeanor of a retired suburban man vanished completely, replaced by the sharp, unforgiving intellect of a corporate architect who built empires and dismantled rivals. He did not care about the offensive sum of money they had offered me. To him, the personal insult was irrelevant noise. What truly captured his attention was the astonishing arrogant stupidity of the Mercer family actively committing a massive corporate governance violation to handle a private domestic dispute. He stood up and motioned for me to follow him down the narrow hallway to his private study. The room smelled faintly of old paper and wood shavings. In the corner sat a heavy fireproof metal filing cabinet that looked like it belonged in a mid-century bureaucratic office. He unlocked the bottom drawer, pulled out a thick, slightly yellowed manila folder, and placed it on his heavy wooden desk. He opened the folder and turned it around so I could read the top document. He explained that exactly 23 years ago, long before I ever met Grant, the Mercer family empire was on the absolute brink of total financial collapse. Victor had recklessly overextended their capital on a series of disastrous, international acquisitions. They were weeks away from defaulting on massive commercial loans, facing a catastrophic liquidation that would have shattered their legacy permanently. They were saved by a massive sudden injection of emergency capital from a highly secretive holding company. My father pointed to the signature at the bottom of the ancient contract. He was the sole proprietor of that holding company. He had bought their debt, stabilized their infrastructure, and quietly stepped back into the shadows. He had never sought a seat on the board. He had never demanded media recognition. He preferred the ultimate power of invisibility. I stared at the financial figures, doing the rapid mental math. I looked up at my father, my voice completely steady, and asked him what that original equity stake was worth in the current market. He adjusted his glasses and casually replied that adjusted for the recent corporate growth and the sheer volume of their government contracts, his personal shares were currently valued at roughly $8 billion. My breath caught in my throat. The Mercers had spent months desperately investigating my background, terrified that I was a peasant trying to steal their wealth. They had absolutely no idea that the quiet woman sitting at their dinner table was the sole heir to the absolute largest individual shareholder of their entire corporate existence. But the vast sum of money was not the weapon my father intended to use. He turned to the third page of the ancient contract and tapped his thick finger against a very specific, heavily bolded paragraph. It was a rigid corporate ethics and governance clause. Because of the sheer size of his capital rescue, my father had insisted on a kill switch. The clause explicitly granted the primary shareholder the absolute legal authority to demand a sweeping independent special review of the executive board if there was any evidence whatsoever that corporate legal assets, public funds, or company resources were being unlawfully utilized to serve the private personal interests of the founding family. The Mercers had not just handed me a divorce settlement. They had officially handed my father the exact legal trigger required to completely dismantle their executive control. My father closed the folder. He looked at me with deep, solemn eyes and told me that he had absolutely no intention of burning the entire company to the ground. He knew that Mercer Infrastructure Dynamics employed tens of thousands of honest, hardworking people who relied on their paychecks to feed their families and pay their mortgages. He was not going to destroy innocent lives just to satisfy a personal vendetta. He simply wanted the people at the very top to finally learn the harsh, unforgiving lesson they had spent their entire privileged lives aggressively avoiding. I agreed with him completely. I told him I did not want a loud, messy, destructive revenge that would drag my name through the mud. I did not want to scream at them in a boardroom or leak their pathetic documents to the press. I wanted something much colder. I wanted them to be forced to look into a mirror and face the undeniable, humiliating truth of their own profound incompetence. My father smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that carried the weight of absolute authority. He promised me that we would not make any unnecessary noise. He said we would simply walk into the light and make it completely impossible for them to ever lie to themselves again. We spent the rest of the morning meticulously planning our next move. We were not going to hire aggressive litigators to send threatening letters. We were not going to warn Grant or give Victor the opportunity to prepare a defense. The quarterly board of directors meeting was scheduled to take place in exactly 4 days. We decided that we would simply attend. We would walk through the front doors of their gleaming corporate headquarters, step into the center of their pristine boardroom, and present the unvarnished truth. We would not need to raise our voices or pound our fists on the table. We would just let the sheer suffocating terror of their own monumental mistake do all the heavy lifting. My phone began ringing before I even crossed the state line back into Georgia. The digital display on my dashboard lit up with Grant's name over and over again. He called me exactly 12 times over the next 48 hours. When I finally pulled over to an empty rest stop and answered, he did not start the conversation with a desperate apology. He did not ask if I was safe. His voice was incredibly tight, breathless, and strictly probing. He was frantically trying to map out the blast radius of his parents' catastrophic miscalculation. He kept asking me what exactly I had told my father. He demanded to know if my father was the type of man to make a loud public scene or contact the financial media. It was a sickening, validating revelation. Grant still viewed the entire horrific dinner purely as a public relations vulnerability, a leakage of classified family data rather than a profound, unforgiving failure of his own moral character. He was performing corporate damage control on his own marriage. While Grant was panicking over optics, Victor Mercer was operating on a completely different frequency of sheer terror. He was a man who demanded instant intelligence, and my parting shot at the dinner table had planted a massive seed of doubt in his arrogant mind. He quietly dispatched his highest-paid corporate fixers to run a comprehensive scorched earth background check on Calvin Hughes, but his team immediately hit a solid, impenetrable wall. The deeper his investigators dug, the more hopelessly entangled they became in a dense thicket of blind trusts, offshore holding companies, and heavily redacted financial records from over 2 decades ago. My father had spent his entire adult life building impenetrable legal fortresses around his wealth, creating layers upon layers of anonymity. Victor's elite team was desperately trying to breach a titanium vault with a plastic spoon, and the lack of actionable intelligence only fueled Victor's mounting paranoia. When aggressive investigation failed to yield results, Elise Mercer deployed her signature brand of toxic, manipulative diplomacy. My phone buzzed constantly with a series of long, carefully crafted text messages from my mother-in-law. She completely dropped the icy, aristocratic tone she had used at the dinner table. Suddenly, she wanted to meet for a private, discreet lunch, just the two of us, to discuss the unfortunate misunderstanding like mature, rational women. It was a transparent, desperately obvious tactic. She wanted to isolate me. She recognized that I had retreated to a place of strength and she needed to separate me from my father's unknown influence. She wanted to drag me back into her sterile, controlled arena where she could manipulate my emotions, twist the narrative, and force a quiet, cheap settlement before the end of the fiscal quarter. I deleted every single message without sending a single word in reply. Inside the corporate archives of Mercer Infrastructure Dynamics, Grant's sister was running her own frantic search. Celeste, utilizing her high security clearance, managed to unear a deeply buried classified financial ledger from 23 years ago. The dusty file detailed a massive life-saving capital injection from an entity named Hughes Meridian Holdings. The dates on the ledger aligned perfectly with the infamous Mercer liquidity crisis, the exact moment their empire almost vanished into bankruptcy. But Celeste, blinded entirely by her own elitist prejudice and staggering class bias, looked at the name of the corporate shell company and then thought of the derogatory descriptions of my father she had gathered from her private investigators. She simply could not reconcile the terrifying financial savior of their global empire with a retired rural man who wore faded canvas work jackets and drove an old truck. Her sheer arrogance convinced her it was merely a bizarre, statistically impossible coincidence of names. She closed the file and dismissed the threat. The Mercer family panic was not just about protecting their fragile pride. There was a massive, merciless ticking clock hanging directly over their heads. Mercer Infrastructure Dynamics was less than 2 weeks away from finalizing an unprecedented multi-billion-dollar joint partnership with a vast coalition of southeastern states to completely overhaul their emergency transit corridors. It was the absolute crown jewel of Victor's entire career, a deal that would cement their legacy for another 50 years. If a corporate governance scandal broke out now, if the public and the state governors learned that the founding family was illegally utilizing corporate legal assets to terrorize a spouse and manipulate succession planning, the state coalition would immediately freeze the contract. The entire historic deal would collapse overnight under the crushing weight of a federal ethics investigation. I knew exactly how these massive government contracts worked because my own agency coordinated closely with those exact same transit corridors. I realized immediately that my ongoing employment at the Logistics Authority could potentially intersect with this massive Mercer deal. I absolutely refused to give the Mercer family a single inch of leverage to claim I was a disgruntled corporate insider trying to actively sabotage their government bids. On Monday morning, I walked straight into the office of my agency director and officially filed a comprehensive, legally binding conflict of interest disclosure. I laid out my current marital status, the pending legal separation, and the potential overlap with the Mercer Coalition bid. I formally quarantined myself from any data, routing protocols, or communications concerning their specific transit routes. It was a preemptive strike of pure professional integrity, a calculated move that would later earn me the unbreakable, genuine respect of the very board members Victor Mercer was desperately trying to impress. Grant finally managed to corner me on Monday evening. He was waiting anxiously by the front concrete steps of my apartment building when I got home from a grueling 12-hour dispatch shift. He looked absolutely terrible. His expensive tailored suit was rumpled. His tie was loose, and he had dark, heavy circles under his exhausted eyes. For the very first time in our entire 3-year relationship, the polished, arrogant corporate facade cracked completely. He reached out, grabbed both of my hands, and told me, his voice genuinely breaking, that he was absolutely terrified of losing me. He begged me to just come back to his house so we could figure a way out of this mess together. I looked at the wealthy, privileged man I had married and felt nothing but an overwhelming, hollow sense of pity. I pulled my hands firmly out of his grasp and asked him one simple, devastating question. I asked him if his father were just a regular working-class man, a mechanic or a high school teacher without a massive fortune to dangle over his head, would he have ever sat there in silence and allowed him to treat his wife the way he did at that dining room table? Grant opened his mouth to defend himself, but absolutely no words came out. He stared down at the cracked pavement in absolute damning silence. He could not answer me because the answer was the ugliest, most cowardly truth of his entire existence. His loyalty was entirely conditional, purchased by the promise of future wealth. I turned my back on him and walked up the stairs to my apartment, leaving him standing alone in the dark. The most agonizing, destructive weapon my father and I deployed during those 4 long days was absolute, unyielding silence. My father did not make a single threatening phone call to Victor. He did not dispatch a team of aggressive, high-priced litigators to the Mercer headquarters to wave subpoenas around. He did not leak a single whisper of the impending scandal to the voracious financial press. He simply waited. To a man like Victor Mercer, who had survived 3 decades by relying on constant control, intimidation, and immediate aggressive responses, that utter silence was psychological torture. Victor completely stopped sleeping. He paced the long, silent hallways of his cavernous estate late into the night, desperately waiting for an attack that never came. He knew deep down in his ruthless, calculating bones that the absolute most terrifying form of power in the world never actually needs to raise its voice to announce its arrival. The morning of the quarterly board of directors meeting finally arrived. The sky over Charlotte was overcast. A cool, dense gray blanket settling heavily over the towering reflective glass skyscrapers of the financial district. My father drove us into the city. He did not rent a limousine. He pulled his dented 10-year-old domestic pickup truck directly into the polished, pristine circular driveway of the Mercer Infrastructure Dynamics Global Headquarters. He parked the battered vehicle right between a row of sleek imported executive luxury sedans. I stepped out of the passenger side of the truck. I was wearing the exact same unbranded minimalist black dress I had worn to their horrific dinner 5 nights earlier. I was not wearing expensive designer armor. I was not carrying a heavy leather briefcase. I walked right beside my father through the towering, heavy revolving glass doors, moving with calm, measured, and perfectly steady steps. I did not look like a discarded, broken woman coming to beg for a fraction of her dignity back. I looked exactly like what I was. I was the catastrophic reckoning they never saw coming, and I was about to walk straight into their absolute stronghold. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the executive floor of Mercer Infrastructure Dynamics. The entire level was a pristine fortress of floor-to-ceiling glass, brushed steel, and the distinct suffocating silence that only accompanies massive concentrations of wealth. There were no ringing phones, no hurried footsteps, no casual conversations. The air itself felt heavily filtered and artificially chilled. We approached the massive semicircular reception desk carved from a single block of dark marble. The young woman sitting behind the monitors was dressed in a razor-sharp designer suit. She looked up and immediately catalogued my father. Her eyes swept over his faded canvas work jacket, his worn denim jeans, and his heavy boots. She offered a tight, dismissive smile, clearly assuming he was a lost courier or a maintenance worker who had accidentally bypassed the service elevator. She asked in a patronizingly sweet voice if he needed directions to the loading dock. My father did not take offense. He simply leaned his large hands against the cool marble of her desk and spoke his full legal name. The receptionist typed the name into her secure terminal with a sigh of mild annoyance. A split second later, the color completely drained from her face. Her posture snapped entirely rigid. Her eyes darted from the glowing screen to my father, wide with sudden absolute terror. She did not ask him to take a seat. She did not ask for a meeting appointment. Her trembling hand reached for the sleek black telephone on her desk. She pressed a single button, whispered frantically into the receiver, and hung up. The atmospheric pressure on the entire floor seemed to instantly harden into solid concrete. The heavy glass security doors leading to the inner executive suite buzzed open automatically. We did not wait for an escort. My father led the way down the long, silent corridor. I walked perfectly in step right beside him. I was not trailing behind him like a frightened dependent. I was not walking into that space as the unwanted wife of the vice president. I was walking with my spine perfectly straight, taking my rightful, legitimate place in the center of the massive corporate earthquake we were about to unleash. At the far end of the corridor stood the primary boardroom. The doors were massive slabs of frosted glass and heavy oak. We did not knock. My father simply pushed the heavy handles down and pushed the doors wide open. The room was cavernous, dominated by a massive conference table carved from a single polished slab of walnut. The entire board of directors was seated in high-backed leather chairs. Victor Mercier stood at the absolute head of the table holding a laser pointer right in the middle of delivering his opening remarks regarding their upcoming quarterly projections. When the heavy door swung open, Victor stopped speaking mid-syllable. His laser pointer dropped to the tabletop with a sharp clatter. He stared at the man standing in the doorway, his arrogant, commanding expression fracturing into a look of absolute, uncomprehending shock. A few of the younger executives looked annoyed by the interruption, but the reaction from the veteran board members was instantaneous and visceral. 3 older men sitting near the center of the table physically recoiled in their chairs. They recognized the faded work jacket. They recognized the broad shoulders and the quiet, terrifying stillness of the man who had bought their survival over 2 decades ago. Frantic, hushed whispers immediately began rippling down both sides of the long walnut table. Victor tried to recover his authority. He slammed his palm flat against the wood and demanded to know the meaning of this intrusion. My father did not raise his voice to compete with Victor. He simply looked at the chief legal counsel, a pale, thin man sitting near the projector, and instructed him to pull up the master shareholder registry and verify his identity for the room. The lawyer's fingers flew frantically across his laptop keyboard. He stared at his screen, swallowed hard, and slowly stood up. He adjusted his tie with trembling fingers. In a voice that shook visibly, he announced to the entire silent room that the man standing by the door was Calvin Hughes. He then read the corresponding equity data aloud. He confirmed on the official corporate record that the man in the faded canvas jacket was currently holding a proprietary equity stake valued at approximately $8 billion. The collective gasp that sucked the air out of the boardroom was incredibly loud. The power dynamic of the entire corporation shifted on its axis in a matter of 5 seconds. Victor was no longer the undisputed king of the castle. He was suddenly just an employee standing in the presence of the man who owned the very ground beneath his feet. I turned my gaze away from Victor and looked directly at Grant. My husband was sitting 3 chairs down from his father. His face was entirely devoid of blood. He looked from the chief legal counsel to my father, and finally, he looked at me. I watched the devastating realization hit his eyes like a physical blow. He stared at my simple black dress and my calm, unbothered expression. In that exact moment, Grant finally understood that I had never been a poor, lucky girl desperate for his money. He realized I had never been less than him in any conceivable metric. I simply possessed the quiet, unbreakable confidence of someone who never felt the pathetic need to prove my worth with a price tag. His entire sense of superiority, the very foundation of his fragile ego, completely collapsed right in front of me. My father did not march up to the head of the table. He did not demand Victor give up his chair. He walked slowly to the back of the room and pulled out two simple observation chairs against the wall. He motioned for me to sit, and then he sat down right beside me. He crossed his legs, folded his hands casually in his lap, and looked at the terrified men sitting around the massive table. He smiled politely and told them he had no intention of hijacking their scheduled agenda. He stated he was simply there in his capacity as the primary shareholder to observe the proceedings. Then, with the casual, effortless tone of a man asking for the time, my father dropped the bomb. He looked directly at the chief legal counsel and gently asked if the board of directors maintained a formal, rigorous internal procedure for investigating the unauthorized use of corporate legal resources and company drafts for the private, personal, domestic benefits of the executive officers. Victor Mercer lost his composure completely. It was the very first time I had ever seen the man panic. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He gripped the edges of the walnut table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He practically shouted, his voice cracking with desperation, demanding that the board ignore the question. He wildly insisted that whatever my father was referring to was strictly a private family matter and had absolutely no place in a corporate governance meeting. But his panic only confirmed the accusation. The chief legal counsel did not back Victor up. The lawyer collapsed back into his leather chair, pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, and began aggressively wiping the sweat pouring down his forehead. The lawyer knew exactly what documents my father was talking about. He knew the distinct forme. He knew he had authorized his department to draft a separation agreement to protect his boss. He knew he was caught in a massive, career-ending federal compliance violation. My father did not say another word. He did not need to. He simply leaned back in his chair and gestured politely for Victor to continue his presentation. Victor tried to resume his speech about infrastructure expansion and state alliances, but his voice lacked all authority. His hands shook as he fumbled with his notes. The boardroom remained completely silent, but nobody was actually listening to the quarterly projections anymore. The business of the day was entirely dead. The remaining hour of the meeting was nothing but a hollow, pathetic theatrical performance. Every single executive, every lawyer, and every veteran board member in that room fully understood the terrifying reality of the situation. The true explosion had already happened, devastating their leadership structure and exposing their illegal activities. The most chilling part of it all was that the man who had effortlessly lit the fuse and brought their entire empire to its knees had accomplished it without ever once needing to raise his voice. The immediate aftermath of the boardroom revelation was not a loud, chaotic explosion. It was a rapid, clinical, and utterly terrifying dismantling. Following my father's precise invocation of his governance clause, a completely independent internal audit team was activated by the terrified board of directors. They descended upon the executive floor with the ruthless, synchronized efficiency of a forensic unit at a major crime scene. They seized hard drives, locked down communication servers, and froze access to the legal archives. What they systematically excavated over the next 72 hours revealed a level of institutional rot that went far deeper than a simple misuse of company letterhead. The truth they dragged into the harsh fluorescent light was infinitely more toxic than the initial insult I had endured. The independent auditors bypassed the superficial layers of the legal department and dug straight into the digital architecture of the company. They did not just find the draft of my separation agreement. They discovered exactly where and how it had been digitally filed within the secure internet. The document was not sitting in an isolated confidential client folder as a private matter. It possessed a highly specific restricted metadata tag that linked it directly to the master directory for the upcoming corporate succession strategy of the third quarter. Victor and Elise had not merely drawn up brutal divorce papers in a vacuum. They had officially legally categorized my removal from the family as a critical mandated prerequisite for the next phase of the Mercer empire. The internal memo surrounding that metadata tag painted a sickeningly clear, undeniable picture of their overarching agenda. Victor was aggressively preparing to publicly announce Grant as the new youthful face of Mercer Infrastructure Dynamics. He was positioning his son to take the absolute lead on the unprecedented multi-billion-dollar state coalition contracts. But the senior Mercers were terrified of my presence in the background. They genuinely believed that a wife who refused to play the sycophantic game, a woman who fundamentally could not read the rigid hierarchy of their social class, would severely damage the pristine aristocratic image they desperately needed to sell to the market. I was not treated as a human being with feelings. I was treated as a defective product feature, a severe liability that needed to be quietly recalled and neutralized before the grand corporate product launch. But the absolute, most devastating discovery did not emerge from the legal team's servers. It came from the corporate communications division. The audit team uncovered a massive, meticulously prepackaged media strategy orchestrated entirely by my sister-in-law, Celeste, utilizing the massive reach and resources of the official corporate public relations apparatus. She had already drafted the press releases regarding our impending divorce long before the envelope was ever slid across the table. She had carefully constructed a completely fabricated, highly sympathetic narrative for her brother. In her polished drafts, I was painted as a fragile, hopelessly overwhelmed civilian who simply could not adapt to the intense, demanding pressures of high society and public life. They had weaponized company resources to preemptively gaslight the entire world. They had prepared to completely rewrite my reality, ensuring their pristine reputation remained completely spotless while I was publicly discarded as a tragic, inadequate failure. The final, undeniable nail in the coffin was provided by an unexpected source. A former executive assistant who had been quietly compiling evidence of Victor's relentless overreach for several years realized the wind had finally shifted. The assistant anonymously surrendered a heavily encrypted internal email chain directly to the lead auditors. The primary message was sent directly from Victor to the chief legal counsel just 2 days before that horrific dinner in Charlotte. The text was brutally succinct and entirely devoid of Victor, had written clearly that if she signs have this processed and finalized before the board meets this month, it was the absolute smoking gun. It proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the chairman of the board was actively manipulating legal timelines to perfectly align with corporate reporting schedules. He had completely obliterated the sacred line between personal vengeance and his fiduciary duty to the shareholders. The sheer suffocating weight of these revelations finally crushed Grant's fragile state of perpetual denial. For the very first time in his sheltered life, he was forced to look at the exact, undeniable blueprints of the conspiracy he had passively enabled. He realized that he was not just a cowardly son caught in a difficult family dynamic. He was a fully licensed attorney and a senior executive officer who had stood idly by while his own parents committed massive documented corporate fraud right under his nose. He had allowed himself to be utilized as a silent pawn in a ruthless boardroom coup disguised as a troubled marriage. He came to my apartment one last time late on a Thursday evening. He did not look like an arrogant heir anymore. He looked like a hollow, entirely broken man who had just watched his entire universe collapse. When I presented him with the printed copies of the audit findings, I did not yell. I demanded the absolute, unvarnished truth. I asked him exactly how long he truly knew about the succession tie-in and the fabricated press releases. Grant slumped heavily against my kitchen counter, buried his face in his hands, and finally broke completely. He confessed that he knew his parents were going to apply extreme, potentially unethical pressure regarding a legal separation. But then, in a display of breathtaking, pathetic cowardice, he admitted his actual thought process. He claimed he had convinced himself they were only going to aggressively scare me. He truly thought they just wanted to push me to the absolute edge so I would finally understand my place, accept their harsh boundaries, and fall in line with the family program. That pathetic whispered confession snapped the very last microscopic thread of trust I possessed. It was a complete revelation of his moral bankruptcy. He had actually believed that psychologically terrorizing his own wife was an acceptable management tactic to ensure domestic compliance. My father, who had been quietly reviewing the daily audit reports from his home in Tennessee, called my cell phone shortly after Grant finished his miserable confession. My father spoke with the calm, terrifying certainty of a Supreme Court judge delivering a final, unappealable verdict. He stated clearly that he still had absolutely no desire to destroy the thousands of innocent jobs at the company. However, the rot at the top was too deep to ignore. He formally announced his intention to call an emergency shareholder meeting by the end of the following week. He was going to ruthlessly execute his supreme governance rights to purge the absolute abuse of power, fully acknowledging that it would undoubtedly strip the entire Mercer family of their executive seats forever. He was going to cut the cancer out of the company, and he did not care if the founding family bled out in the process. I hung up the phone and looked back at Grant. He was staring at me, his eyes wide, begging for a miraculous pardon I was completely incapable of giving. I walked slowly over to the front door, unlocked it, and pulled it wide open. I gestured for him to leave my home permanently. He hesitated, searching my face for any lingering warmth. Before he crossed the threshold to step out into the cold night, I delivered the final defining assessment of his character. I looked directly into his terrified eyes and told him the exact, devastating truth. I said that they thought money could buy my departure. You are even worse. You thought your silence could keep me here. Exactly 7 days later, the emergency shareholder assembly convened in the grand amphitheater of the corporate headquarters. The atmosphere was incredibly sterile, devoid of the usual arrogant swagger that typically accompanied Mercer executive gatherings. The massive room was packed with the full board of directors, a panel of independent ethics advisors, a team of forensic financial auditors, and external legal counsel brought in specifically to oversee the proceedings. This was the absolute point of no return. Every single knot they had tied in the dark was about to be violently unraveled under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the fluorescent lights. Victor Mercer made his final desperate play for survival. He stood at the center podium wearing his most expensive tailored suit, attempting to project the formidable aura of a seasoned captain guiding his ship through a minor storm. He gripped the edges of the wooden stand and tried to diminish the entire catastrophic conspiracy. He used his deep, commanding voice to assure the terrified board that the entire situation was nothing more than an unfortunate domestic misunderstanding, a private family conflict that had tragically bled over into the office space. He promised them that his leadership remained completely uncompromised and that the state coalition contracts were still completely secure. He was immediately cut off by the lead investigator from the external legal team. The independent lawyer did not argue with Victor. He simply pressed a button on his remote, illuminating the massive projector screen behind the podium. The screen displayed a chronological, irrefutable timeline of the conspiracy. The lawyer read aloud the intercepted internal email chains, matching them perfectly with the specific billing codes and the classified file directories from the legal department. He outlined the exact hours billed by company attorneys to draft my separation agreement. He displayed the meeting schedules proving that Victor had actively diverted corporate resources to execute a personal vendetta. The evidence completely destroyed Victor's defense. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a fully funded, highly orchestrated abuse of corporate power designed to protect their own private interests. The investigation did not stop with Victor. The independent counsel turned his attention to Elise Mercer, who was sitting in the front row with her posture perfectly rigid. The screen shifted to display the internal communications from the Strategic Public Relations Division. The lawyer read the preemptive press releases Elise had personally authorized. He exposed her calculated instructions to the media team, revealing her explicit demand to paint me as an emotionally unstable woman who could not handle the pressures of their elite society. The entire room collectively gasped. They realized Elise had not only attempted to buy me out, but she had also prepared a massive company-funded smear campaign to completely rewrite my reality in the event I refused to sign their paperwork. Elise stared straight ahead, her face completely pale as the aristocratic mask she had worn her entire life shattered into a million irreparable pieces in front of her most important peers. Then the independent counsel called upon Grant as an involved party and a senior corporate officer. My husband was formally requested to address the assembly and provide his official statement. The entire amphitheater fell into a deafening silence. Every single person in the room waited to see if the golden heir would continue to lie to protect the crumbling family empire or if he would finally locate a tiny shred of human decency. Grant stood up slowly. He looked exhausted, stripped of all his usual corporate arrogance. He did not look at his father. He did not look at his mother. He looked directly across the room at me. In the biggest, most unexpected pivot of his entire life, Grant walked up to the microphone and completely surrendered. He publicly and unequivocally confirmed every single detail of that horrific dinner. He admitted to the thick envelope, the oppressive legal documents, and his own pathetic, cowardly silence. He spoke clearly into the microphone, his voice echoing through the massive room, and formally renounced his right to be considered for any future succession or executive leadership role. He looked down at the floor and openly confessed that he had profoundly failed both as a sworn officer of the company and as a husband. The voting process that followed was swift, brutal, and entirely unanimous. With my father backing the independent coalition, the Mercer family was systematically gutted of their operational authority. Victor Mercer was formally stripped of his title and forcibly removed from his seat as the executive chairman. Elise Mercer was permanently dismissed from her controlling role within the family philanthropic foundation. Celeste Mercer was immediately terminated from her position within the Strategic Communications Group. An interim, entirely independent chief executive officer was appointed on the spot to salvage the pending state contracts and stabilize the market panic. In less than 2 hours, the founding family was completely exiled from the very empire they had built. When the assembly concluded, the remaining board members turned their attention to me. There was a palpable expectation in the air. They assumed that my ultimate reward for triggering this massive corporate coup would be a demand for an executive seat, a massive transfer of voting power, or an astronomical financial settlement to quietly walk away. I stood up from my chair and addressed the remaining executives. I did something that completely defied every single cynical expectation they held. I announced that I had officially filed my divorce papers that very morning. Furthermore, I stated on the official corporate record that I was completely waiving my right to any spousal support, and I was categorically rejecting every single cent of the private settlement money the Mercer family had originally offered me. I looked at the stunned faces of the corporate lawyers and told them that I did not need a single dime to walk away from a place that had fundamentally failed to respect me as a human being. I was leaving with my own money, my own career, and my own absolute dignity. I walked out of the amphitheater and headed straight for the grand glass exit. Grant caught up with me in the sprawling empty marble foyer. He looked completely desperate, stripped of his titles, his future, and his pride. He reached out, his hands trembling, and begged me for one final chance. He pleaded that everything was different now, that the toxic influence of his parents was gone, and that we could finally start over and build a real life together. I stopped walking and looked at him for the very last time. I felt no anger, no sorrow, and no desire for vengeance. I only felt a cold, absolute clarity. I delivered the final, most expensive lesson he would ever learn. I told him that he did not lose me when he became poor. I told him that he lost me the exact moment he sat there in silence and allowed other people to put a price tag on my life. I turned my back on him and pushed through the heavy revolving doors. I walked out into the bright afternoon sun and got into my outdated, heavily dented sedan. I turned the ignition, feeling the familiar rumble of the old engine, and drove away from the towering glass headquarters. My final revenge was not taking their castle or claiming their throne. My ultimate retribution was driving away with a profound, chilling sense of relief, knowing that the Mercer family would be forced to sit on the sidelines for the rest of their lives. They had to watch their precious company continue to thrive and exist, but it would never again belong to them on their own arrogant terms. I did not take their empire away from them. I simply exposed the truth, and in doing so, I proved to the entire world that they were no longer worthy of holding it. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please leave a comment down below and let me know where in the world you're listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. I also invite you to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even further by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people. Thanks.